Good afternoon. Welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned in to Take Control of Color, hosted by BenQ. And for that, we need Art Suwansang. Welcome. Art, what's going on, man?
Hey, Derek. Thank you. Great to be here.
It is great to have you talking about color. We all know how important it is. So I'll take this time to invite all of our viewers, if you do have any questions over the next hour, get them in. But Art, they don't want to learn it from me. That's why we got you here, the expert. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Perfect. Sounds good. Let me start the screen share, and then we'll jump right into it. All right. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me learning about color management. It's very interesting, right? Because it's one of those topics where I would say that we may not think about it much until we run into an issue with color. And that's when we would really think about color management. And this is really important. So anyway, we're going to talk about color. Let's bring some color into this picture. I just thought that was some fun effects, right? Anyway, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Art Suwansang. I'm a photographer, educator, technologist. I do consulting with photographers on a variety of topics, from how to set up your Lightroom catalog, to color management, to printing, to pretty much running a NAS on your network, or setting up 10 gigabit Ethernet, like all those geeky stuff that you wish you have that geek friend. I am that friend, essentially. So I love espresso, I love sushi, and I thought you'd like to know that about me in the event you ever send me some coffee or sushi. But anyway, the best place to find me online is youtube.com/artisright. And that is my brand name. I also have a sub brand name as well called In Art We Trust. So that's just kind of like a fun thing that I do. All right. As Derek said before, you have any questions, please do chime in. If it's really relevant to the topic that I'm covering, he will intercept midway through and just kind of bring the question up. If not, we'll leave some time at the end to do Q&A as well. And on that note, I am affiliated with a few companies. I am BenQ ambassador and also Calibrate ambassador as well. I'm also an Adobe partner and influencer and an x-rite Colorati. So a lot of color companies that I really work with. All right, let's move forward here. So we are here to go over display calibration. Now, some of you may have a lot of questions about this and everything. So we're going to give you a rundown of all these topics. And here's the thing. I'm going to be able to speak about all these things and go into a lot of depth, which I'm going to do to some extent. I'm not going to, take this full deep dive into explaining like engineering, like how this works in the background, but I'm going to give you a good idea for what color management is and what it can do for you. Now, the whole idea for this whole thing is so that you are vaguely familiar with the concept of color management. I don't expect any of us attending this program to become an expert like me, but at least if we know about it enough, we can be familiar with it so that anytime we have a conversation with someone about color management, well, some of the vocabulary in the word will come back to you, and that's the whole goal. The first thing I want to talk about, and this is something that has already been going on for, I would say, like about a year and a half now, or a little bit longer, is that x-rite have made a strategic change, and they have transitioned all their consumer products to Calibrate. So if you ever see x-rite before, they're Calibrate now. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as well, just to kind of bring light to this topic a little bit more. And product marketing name for i1 has now changed the name to Color Checker. So everything is going to be Color Checker, or the way how Calibrate has abbreviated that is CC. Now, just in case you wonder what Calibrate stands for, it stands for calibration done right. So that's a pretty clever name they came up with there. You can find out more about Calibrate at calibrate.com. And going forward, even if you have an x-rite device, Calibrate software will continue to work with x-rite devices as well. All right. So the one thing I want to really touch on first before we get into display calibration is to cover the topic of the type of calibrators that are out there. Now, some of you may have heard about this before. This may be new to some of you, but we're going to go over them. These are the consumer products that are available from Calibrate, and they fall into two different categories. So one of them is the colorimeter, and the other one is the color spectrophotometer. The colorimeters, they're really designed, they're smaller. In fact, I'm actually holding one in my hand now to get a relative bearing on size. And this is the size of it compared to like an iPhone, it is fairly smaller. It's really designed to calibrate displays and projectors only. It can't not do anything else. And then we also have another device category called a color spectrophotometer. So what this can do is that it can calibrate display projectors. It can do paper profiling as well. So you do any type of inkjet print in your studio or home office, well, this may be the device you may want to consider because you can create a profile. Now, something to keep in mind, though, is that this color spectrophotometer you're seeing right now, the CC Studio or Color Checker Studio, is an entry-level device. There are much more expensive and also better sensor color spectrophotometer out there. So just kind of know that as you're going through this. As far as colorimeter goes, there are different class of device. There's, for example, like Color Checker Display, Display Pro, and Plus. We're going to talk about some of the differences between those just a little bit here, but we're not going to really spend too much time on it. Essentially, it divides the device into a few different categories. I'm going to show you that in a few slides. So, but before we do that, let's quickly talk about some of the benefits of these two devices. So a colorimeter, it's really cost effective. It is faster for display calibration. In fact, I really feel that using a colorimeter is going to give you a better display calibration result compared to a spectrophotometer most of the time. Unless you really go in and really fine tune the setting and use a high-end spectrophotometer, you're really going to get a much better result from a colorimeter. And this will be perfect for anyone that doesn't do any type of in-studio printing. Now, something to note about a color spectrophotometer is that when you try to calibrate a display with a spectrophotometer, it's going to take 2 to 4 times as long to calibrate the display. Now, the nice thing about this is that it is an all-in-one device for display, for projector, for print. So you can do so many things with this device. It's kind of like one of those Swiss Army knives for color management. But if you don't print, again, go with a colorimeter. If your workflow involves printing, you want to create your own profile or you want to start to dabble in it, I would say that a spectrophotometer is definitely something to consider. But ultimately, I mean, what you can also do as well is download profiles from the paper manufacturer or the website and use that. And generally, you're going to be okay going that route too. And this is where I am going to share with you a little bit about the different solutions that are out there. So we made the right decision, so we can make the right decision when we're looking at these devices. So there's 2 solutions from Calibrate. There's the simplified solution and there's a pro solution. The simplified one involves the software. Well, you can see like the x-rite former, Calibrate current. But you can see the software is called i1 Studio before. It had moved over to CC Studio. Essentially very similar software, just slightly different branding on it. And then you have 2 devices on there. So you have the i1 Display Studio or the CC Display. Both of those will work with the CC Studio software or the i1 Studio or Color Checker Studio spectrophotometer device. Now, the only confusion about this is that the software and the spectrophotometer carry the same name. So just, you know, if you ask someone a question, just be very clear whether you're talking about CC Studio software or CC Studio spectrophotometer or the calibration device. So, you know, so that you're having conversation with someone and they're not really confused whether you're talking about the software or the device. Now, with this simplified solution, one thing you don't get from this thing is that when you run the calibration, you can't do any validation with it. The solution will not allow you to do validation, which is kind of the key thing if you want to just, you know, guarantee you're going to get the best color possible. The other thing too is that generally these devices are not compatible with third-party software. For example, if you're using a BenQ hardware calibrated display, CC Display or CC Display Studio will not work with that. That's BenQ SW line or any other hardware calibrated display companies out there. CC Studio will work with BenQ, but not any other hardware calibrated display brand other than BenQ. All right, so now we have the pro solution from x-rite, and these are the devices that I recommend. So you have really 2 devices that you can choose from, CC Display Pro and CC Display Plus, or Color Checker Display Pro, Display Plus. The difference between these 2 is that the Display Pro can calibrate display up to 1000 nits. The Display Plus can calibrate display up to 2000 nits. And the Display Plus, because it has the updated, a little more sensitive sensor, if you're doing video and you want to do a calibration in BT 1886, well, the Display Plus would definitely be the one to choose. Otherwise, if you're a photographer and you're really going to be calibrating your display anywhere between 80 to 160 nits, the the Color Checker Display Pro, sometimes I still go by this former name. The Color Checker Display Pro will work just fine, and that's the one that I highly recommend that you choose. A couple other things I also want to point out as well is that if you should have these Color Monkey devices in your studio or in your office, they still function with the current set of software. So CC Studio would continue to work with i1 Display Studio and also Color Monkey Display. The big one you saw down there next to the i1 Studio is the Color Monkey Photo. It's that, really big unit there. And that will also work with CC Studio as well. So I just want to bring us up to speed on the calibration devices, the solution that are on the market, and also share with us that if you have these devices already, you may not necessarily need to buy a new one. Unless you get a BenQ, of course, and you have these devices, then you need a little bit more of a pro device to run that calibration. So my recommendation to get is just to invest the money, buy this once, CC Display Pro or CC Display Plus, and it will work just fine. Now, I also want to give you one more food for thought as well, and that, yes, Calibrate devices do command a premium in the market, but one thing that I'll tell you right now is that the CC Display Pro was formerly the i1 Display Pro, and that was released back in around, I would say 2007 or so. It is still the same device being sold today. And that's how much forward thinking x-rite and now Calibrate has put into their product design. So when you pay that premium, you're not paying the premium every 3 to 4 years when a new generation device comes out. You're paying that premium once, and the software would then upgrade to keep up with the new display technology that are coming on the market. So yeah, even though they do carry a more premium price versus other calibrators that are out there on the market, it actually is a better investment for long term, because I'll tell you this, my original device from 2007 still works just fine, and I still have that. So very interesting stuff there. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what happens during display calibration and the kind of calibrations that you can do, because there's really a lot of things to really talk about. And I'm going to start out this conversation with the following. This is the phrase I come up with. Photography is the exact science of approximation. And this just pretty much summarizes everything that you do with photography. You could try to produce the same shot again. There's going to be some slight changes in the light. It may be like a third of a stop more, a third of a stop less. Same thing with calibration. You try to do a calibration one time, you may get a really good calibration. Next time, well, it may be better. It may be a little bit not as good, but we shouldn't really obsess over this. And I'm going to tell you the reason why that's not really a great idea. But before we do that, I need to segment and really talk about the different display types that are out there. So essentially, the way how we can look at this is that there are a few display types. So there are hardware calibrated display for photographers, such as BenQ SW line. There are external displays, and these are most of the displays you'll see in the market, and 90% of what you have seen your entire life, unless you're constantly in and out of a photography studio or a high-end creative studio, that you'll see mostly hardware calibrated displays. And the thing with external displays is that there are some of them out there that are made for general use, and there are some that are calibrated more rigorously from the factory, such as BenQ PD line, that are really created and designed for professionals. And I have tested all of these displays. And then the other category of display that we have are internal built-in display to devices, such as the one built into an iMac, a MacBook Pro, or any Apple device, or PC, laptop, all-in-one PC for that matter. So, and then we can... From there, we can then divide the display into two different categories, hardware calibration and software calibrated, as you see right now. Now, there's one distinction I want to bring up on here that I think it would be interesting, and that is, if you take a look at this, when you take a look at external displays, whether it's hardware or software calibration, that's the reason why the box is highlighting these two right now, there are certain capabilities that you can do to these displays that majority of the built-in displays cannot do, with the exception of Apple latest Pro Display XDR or Liquid Retina XDR display that is built into the 14-16-inch MacBook Pro that has different reference mode. But most of the other laptop displays out there, and also some PC exceptions, most of them are going to be fairly, a software calibrated display. You can't really do much with it. The way how they're calibrated from the factory is pretty much what you are going to get. All right. Let's first talk about the premise of calibration. So the one thing you need to know, and some have gotten this concept slightly misunderstood. There is some misunderstanding about this concept. And the one thing we need to know is that both software and hardware calibrated display in general would produce an ICC profile or ICM profile if you're in the Windows world. And those profile would get attached to display via the OS for the color aware program to use. Now, if there's any other display manufacturers out there that claims to have, for example, a hardware calibrated display that has a software that doesn't generate an ICC ICM software, I would probably stay away from that because it has a lot of ramifications for color aware program. Now, I've been working with hardware calibrated display for quite some time, especially with BenQ. And I know that the method the BenQ uses is definitely like really refined and is something that has been, using the method that are adopted as the industry standard. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is software calibration and talk about the ICC profile characteristic for software calibrated display. The one thing we have to remember is that when we have an ICC profile on a software calibrated display, this would be BenQ PD displays or any of your built-in displays on your laptop, your iMac, whatever that may be. Every time you run a calibration on that, what you're really doing is that ICC profile is changing the color output from the video card before it even gets to the display. It's not even down the pipeline. It's just pretty much the signals coming out from the card. It's already been changed by that ICC profile. So the very oversimplified way for me to show this to you is in that RGB and grayscale graph that you're seeing right now. When you do a software calibrate, when you have a software calibrated display and it produces an ICC profile, well, pretty much there's a lot of tones that are going to get switched. Some tones are going to get expanded and everything like that in order for the color to match. The best way to think about a software calibrated display is to think of it like a JPEG. Now, it's, can be argued and said that it's better to get the picture than not at all. So if you only have a camera that shoots JPEG, you might as well get the picture, right? Same thing with display. It's better to calibrate your display than not to calibrate at all. So if you only have a software calibrated display, then doing a calibration is better than not doing any type of calibration whatsoever. Now, the other thing I want to talk about software calibration too is that if you play with Photoshop before using curve to do color adjustment, you will know that as you start to adjust one color, another color is starting to adjust and everything like that. I mean, it pulls like the adjacent color and the opposite color. Pretty much that's also the same thing that's happening with software calibration on the video card. All right. So with that, this leads us to the next thing, which is hardware calibrated display. So on this hardware calibrated display in general, for example, BenQ SW again, there is a hardware chip on the inside. It's pretty much just a computer chip. And on that computer chip, it contains a lookup table or what they call a LUT. And what you're seeing right now is a 3D LUT that is like that really nice color cube. I wish it looks like that in real life. It doesn't. It's just literally a whole bunch of line of codes inside the display that does the color adjustment, but that's a really cool visualizer. So anyway, in general, the way how we can visualize and see 3D LUT is that it's pretty much that 3D cube space that has all those colors defined. So when you're running a calibration on a hardware calibrated display, the display is taking the signal from the computer as is, and what it's doing is that it's doing all the color adjustment via that chip. Now, the advantage you're going to get from this is, again, a very oversimplified comparison, but you can see that there's a jaggedy curve on the back there, and like the curve on the front one is smooth on a hardware calibrated display. That gives you a rough idea of what hardware calibrated display is like. Now, the reality of this is that a hardware calibrated display, it just pretty much lets your computer loose, saying output whatever you can. Now, the curve may not be that smooth, but you get the idea. And all the color adjustment is done at the panel level. So when you're doing when you have a hardware calibrated display and you have that ICC profile, it's like shooting a raw file because there's no adjustment from the signal coming out from your computer whatsoever. This minimizes banding, digital posterization, all these other things that happens or could have happened with a software calibrated display. Now, don't get me wrong. Our calibration technology and software calibrated display and display technology in general have come a very long way that chances of you seeing that are very less likely nowadays. But, these are the main differences between software and hardware calibrated display. The other nice advantage of having a hardware calibrated display is that if you have a multi-display setup, you can guarantee that each of those displays will be showing the colors correctly independently of each other. Because a lot of times on our video card on the computer itself, many times it can only output to one LUT. These are just, one lookup table. Certain selective computers, for example, Mac laptop has been known to, output to like 2 LUTs for displays and everything like that. But having a hardware calibrated display is great because all the color and adjustment information is actually stored on the panel itself. So you don't really have to worry about the video card limitation when it comes to that, that end of things. Now, a few other things to note about a hardware calibrated display too is that what you want to do is you want to use the display manufacturer software to do the calibration. And the reason why you want that is because if you use a software that comes with your calibration device, for example, if I have the Color Checker Display Pro, if I use CC or Color Checker Profiler with this, it will do the calibration, but it will only do a software calibration because these calibrator device manufacturer software or these, calibration device software does not talk to the 3D lookup table inside the display. And this is the reason why you want to use the display manufacturer software, because their software is tuned to talk with that 3D lookup table and do all the color adjustment. Now, the other thing too is that if your hardware calibrated display is compatible with third-party software, for example, CalMan or Light Illusion, you can certainly use those to do calibration as well. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, CalMan or Light Illusion, those are really professional level software that are, I would say, they're fairly pricey to get a hold of, to license the software to use. And there are also a steep learning curve on using those software at the very same time. So just something to think about there. All right. Let's move on in our conversation. And if you have a BenQ SW display, only for the SW line, not the PD, the best recommendation is use BenQ Palette Mastering Element. Now, what I want to go over next is give you a glimpse into the calibration, what happens during the display calibration process. If you've done this before, you will notice that your display flashes a whole bunch of colors and you're like, what's really going on here, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take 3 colors, red, green, and blue, from that color checker chart that we have earlier. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. So this red, green, and blue and all the colors that is flashing on your screen can be defined as RGB, but better yet, they are technically defined in a lab color space, or even just, like the larger color space in lab, which is like the, the original CIE color space, but we're just going to say they're using mostly lab for now. So all these are lab known coordinates. These are the color space, another color gamut that is like really large. And what happens when you run a calibration is that, well, something to think about is that your display has a refresh rate, right? How many hertz your refresh rate is. Most of the time, displays run at 60. Some of them run at 120, 144, 165. There are different hertz. But anytime you see that hertz thing, what it really means is that your display is refreshing that many times per second. So there's a lot of data being pushed to the display. And what we have to remember when we run the display calibration is that we are really just taking a slice of that moment in time that, one of those like 60 times per second that are being measured. That's why the reason when you do multiple calibration, each time is slightly different, because there is a zone, there is an acceptable area. And what you want to do is you want to calibrate your display so that it lands in that zone. That's pretty much what happens with any type of single calibration that are out there. There are tolerances, and as long as it lands within that tolerance, it's considered good. Same thing with display calibration. So one thing that I don't recommend doing, and I heard some of these before, is that I've heard some recommend that you go out and calibrate your display 3 different times and choose the best one. No, just calibrate it once. And as long as you can land in a good zone, which we're going to talk about next, you're perfectly going to be just fine. All right. So what happens during calibration? So we see the thing on the chart right there for the red, green, and blue. So there's what you see in the chart right below those color swatches are the reference and measure. REF is the reference value. That is what is supposed to be. And the MEA stands short for measured value. Now you can see that the reference and the measured for each one of these values, red, green, and blue, are off. And some of them are off by a huge amount. Some of them are off by a smaller amount. However, those numbers are not lining up the exact same way. Well, What happens is this. You're looking at the reference number right now, and these are the measurement value. These, like I said before, the numbers are slightly off from each other. So at the end, what your software is really doing is this. It applies a linear curve at the start of calibration, so it doesn't really matter what ICC profile you choose. It will apply a neutral ICC profile automatically to your system. It's going to flash those colors. The program knows the reference value or what those colors are supposed to be, and it's taking the measurement value. At the end, what you have in an ICC profile, in a nutshell, and this is where some things happen slightly different on a hardware calibrated display. It happens on the hardware. On a software calibrated display, it happens on the ICC, but it's doing that last column that you see, which is the ADJ, which is the adjustment. So on that last column, it's pretty much giving you the adjustment to the color, how they're supposed to look and everything. And that's the main idea behind this whole thing, is that there are color adjustment. And notice that the reference and the adjusted value doesn't really quite land. Not really quite the same, but they come really close. And the reason why is because, again, every time you're doing color adjustment, right, it's like doing a curve in Photoshop. You want that number to be this value, but anytime you adjust, a specific number, for example, you adjust red, you're affecting the opposite cyan pretty much right away. And that's also still happening with software and hardware calibrated display. All right. So the adjustments that are happening at the with the calibration on the software calibrated display, remember, it's like shooting JPEG. Hardware calibrated display is like shooting RAW. So here are some of the information contained within this ICC profile. On the software calibrated display, in a nutshell, it contains the color gamut information. It contains the color adjustment. These are all the refinements that it needs to do to get the colors right. It has the gamma and also the white point. For a hardware calibrated display, similar set of information. The only thing that it doesn't really contain is the color adjustment. It still has the gamut, the gamma, and the white point that you use for calibration. But everything else, well, pretty much all the color adjustment, like I said before, is done on the panel, so you don't really have to worry about that. And those are the main differences between these two. Now let's talk about delta E. This is roughly the formula for delta E 2000. And you can take a look at this. You can actually go and take a look at this on Wikipedia is also there too. But essentially what delta E describes is how off your adjusted value is from what the reference is supposed to be, or in layman's terms, how accurate your color is. Now, there's a range that you need to consider for delta E, obviously, but as you can see right now, this is taken from an actual calibration. You can see that the red delta E is 0.51, green is 0.39, blue is 0.76. These are all fairly great delta E values, and anything below 1, your eyes can't really tell them apart. So in a nutshell, a delta E below 3 is considered good. Anything below 2 is considered great, because truth be told, unless those two colors are pretty much sitting right next to each other, we can't really tell these two apart anymore. A delta E of 2, it's hard to really see those. And you can see, for example, a delta E report when you do the validation at the end of CC Profiler, I1 Profiler, and that's what the screen would look like. You can even export that out. And on the BenQ display, this is kind of the delta E value that you would get at the end of each calibration. All right. So I don't know if this is going to translate on your end or not. If it does, that's fantastic. Oops. If it does, that would be great. If it doesn't, I'm going to try my best to describe this, but this is pretty much showing you a delta E of 3. And you can see right now that when the two colors are not next to each other, it's really hard to tell them apart. But when they're next to each other, everyone can see a delta E of 3. But if they're not next to each other, that's really hard for us to see. If we simplify this down to a delta E of 2, this even changes it even further, where it's even harder to tell these two apart. And even though they're next to each other, it's still very difficult to see them. All right. So now let's talk about the external hardware and software calibrated displays, some of the capabilities and what you do get with this whole thing. So with these external displays, you have the ability to go in and choose the color gamut that you want to work in. This would also apply to Apple more Pro displays as well. So any Apple displays, externally that they're selling right now, for example, Studio Display and also Pro Display XDR, including the Liquid Retina XDR display inside the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. Those are now considered like the Pro display from Apple, that you can choose a different color mode that you want to work in. So with that, a lot of these external displays are still going to be limited to what colors they calibrated from the factory. Same thing with Apple displays. For example, if the display is not capable of showing Adobe RGB, there's not going to be an Adobe RGB color mode there. That will be also to some extent the same with a hardware calibrated display. Although with a hardware calibrated display, even though they did not calibrate certain color modes from the factory, well, you can still go in and use the software to do a hardware calibration on it and still calibrate in that color mode. So it does gain you some advantage and give you the freedom to working in the color gamut that you prefer to be working in. All right, so let's talk about some of the differences between a software and a hardware calibrated display. And this is one of those charts that pretty much will give you a pretty good idea, overview of everything we talk about in summary. So with a hardware calibrated display, you have the ability to choose the color gamut and also the color space you want to work in. And there's really no limitation as far as going to calibrate these. With a software calibrated display, you have the external variety, and you're going to be somewhat limited to what the manufacturer pre-calibrated from the factory. For example, even if the display, for example, is capable of showing 99% Adobe RGB, but if the manufacturer didn't calibrate this external software calibrated display in that color mode, well, it's going to be very difficult for you to really go in and utilize that color mode in your workflow. For built-in display, well, pretty much most of the time now they calibrated P3, you're pretty much just stuck with that. Unless you're using one of those Apple, 14, 16-inch MacBook Pro. Otherwise, you're pretty much just stuck with all of those. So the ability to calibrate in other gamuts, you can see on the hardware and software calibration, you can do that with the built-in display. We're going to say, if you don't have the more advanced one from Apple, you can't really do that right now. Adjustable 3D LUT, the only one that has that is a hardware calibrated display. The other two doesn't have those. All of them, on the contrary, need an ICC profile for it to function and work properly. And the ICC profile on a hardware calibration does not do any color remapping whatsoever. It only contains the gamut, white point, and gamma information. I didn't put gamma on there, but that's the one thing I'm adding on. On a software calibration, it contains all those information, including the color adjustment. And that's where the differences comes in between these two type of displays. So this is a brief idea for BenQ SW display lineup by size. You can take a look at there. There's like, different sizes you can choose from depending on your workflow. There's like 2Ks and 4Ks. And one thing that I want to really just briefly touch on as well is that there's been a lot of conversation lately that 4K displays is not compatible or is not optimized for Mac or anything like that. I want to kind of just sort that a little bit and tell you that I have been using dual 4K display on Mac since the Intel days up to like the M1 generation. I'm using the M1 Ultra. I've tested the M1 Max, M1, M1 Pro, all the varieties, including M2 chip, and they run on 4K displays just fine. Truth be told, a Mac computer, or any computer for that matter, does not really care how much pixel per inch or PPI your display has. It will still output the pictures in the same way. The only thing that we have to realize on a Mac is that when it comes to 4K displays or anything higher than that, these are called HDTV. These are called like high resolution displays. And with that, if you run, for example, 4K at native, the text and everything become really small. So what Mac does is that it scales the display, or it scales the entire operating system interface to, to like a larger size, whatever that may be, in order to make it easier for us to read the text on the display. Now, some perceive this type of scaling when you're doing 4K scaling as text not being quite as sharp as, for example, a display that has a pixel per inch that crosses that 200 pixels per inch threshold. But the reality of it is that this is a really case-by-case basis. And my best recommendation is go to BH, go to a trade show. If you're not near BH, go to Best Buy or something and see how a 4K display would scale on an Apple computer, and just have a look at it for yourself, because the perception that every one of us have would be different. But what I can tell you though is that 4K display has no problem running on Mac, including any of the Apple Silicon whatsoever. A couple of other things I want to add on is that before you do a display calibration, there are certain things to really think and consider about. And I will include another slide on this at the end as well, but the best place to really find out information about this is my YouTube channel. And because every single operating system has, slight changes in their interface. For example, Ventura changes the system preferences, including a name of it, to now system settings. So there are a lot of changes for location and everything. And rather than showing you a slide of what the screenshot looks like, I would just go and pick the operating system that you have and turn off all those settings before you do display calibration. So for hardware calibrated display, it's going to be very similar to software calibrated display with some minor differences. And I get this question all the time. Is there any color mode that I have to set on my BenQ SW before I do the calibration or brightness? The answer to that is no. You just leave it as is. You run Palette Master Element. It will talk to display and change to the appropriate color mode that you have it set to, the calibration mode, and set the gamut automatically through the program. That's the one magical nice thing about it. And also the brightness. You set how much you want the brightness to be in the program, and it does all the adjustment for you automatically. There is no need to set any ICC profile before you do display calibration, because when you start the calibration process, the program will automatically apply a linear neutral profile for you automatically. Now, on the Mac side of things, you just need to make sure that you turn off HDR. This will also apply to PC as well. And specifically to Mac, the one that has a camera built in, these would be the iMac, the laptop computers, for instance, or any Mac that has a built-in display. What you want to do is turn off True Tone, because if you don't, True Tone does not only affect built-in display on the Mac, it also affects any external display link up to the Mac as well. And what True Tone is really designed to do is that the camera on your Mac is constantly sensing the color temperature in your environment. And with True Tone turned on, well, it's trying to match the white point of your display to the white point of the environment. So if you have like a window light coming in and light is changing throughout the days, your display is constantly changing, and that's not good to do calibration with whatsoever, nor is it good to do professional color workflow on a display that's constantly changing colors. So turn that off. Also change the screen off time. That's something that I definitely recommend, because Mac, they set that to like maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes or so. It's really low. So you want to bring it up to at least 20 or 30 minutes. This way, your screen doesn't turn off in the middle of calibration. And also, I recommend turning off screensaver, because on a Mac, by default, it's set to come up after 20 minutes. But if your calibration takes a little bit longer than that, which I highly doubt it does, but if it should, then it just ruins the calibration and you have to start over again. So just turn those off and you have a much better calibration experience. Now, for software calibrated display, everything is just about the same. But before you run the calibration, you have to choose the color mode on your display, what color gamut you want to work in. And usually on your display menu, there are all those different color modes you can choose from. So define the color gamut you want to work in first. Next, you're going to have to adjust the brightness. Now, you do this brightness adjustment when you start the calibration process. And I have so many walkthrough step-by-step guide on how to do this on my YouTube channel as well. Again, the process is slightly different for different laptops or different computers. So I would have you choose the machine type that you have and follow those guides, which will walk you through pretty much like point by point on how to do something. But the brightness adjustment is done during calibration for a software calibrated display. Now, again, there's no need to set up the ICC profile, because the program would automatically apply a neutral curve. And remember to turn off all these things for PC, turn off HDR, auto brightness, Mac, same thing, HDR, auto brightness, True Tone, make sure that's a turn off, change the screen off time, and turn off screensaver again. Now, if you have an Apple XDR mini LED display, this will be the Pro Display XDR, or That's the $6,000 display, or the one built into the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. These are the mini LED one. My best recommendation is to use a different reference mode and preset on these displays, and I have made extensive guide explaining what reference mode and presets are. I've also showed you how to set these and customize these as well. And what I would recommend doing afterwards, if you have, for example, the Calibrate or x-rite Pro devices like this, or Color Checker Display Pro or Color Checker Display Plus, or any of the equivalent devices, is to do a fine-tuned calibration. Don't calibrate these display yet, because the software that we have currently out on the market right now is not capable of calibrating these mini LED displays just yet. So for the Apple one, don't recommend calibrating it. Just do a fine-tuned calibration and you'll be good for that one. And as usual, if you want to find out more about how to do this, more explanation in detail, I have over 100 videos on color management up on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/artistwrite. Now, the other question that some have also asked me as well is that what would be a good frequency to calibrate your display? Because many of us has the idea that if we buy one of these, why buy one of these when we can borrow from a friend, because we're really only going to use this once? And the answer to is not quite as simple as we think, because you technically should be calibrating your display about every 2 to 4 weeks or so, because your display does drip over time. This happens way more on the big tube display days, but in the LCD display, there are still color changes and color shift are happening. So my recommendation is for you to go in and calibrate your display. I would say like every 2 to 4 weeks or so, or before you start a large project. Those would be like a really good time to go and run a display calibration. This way you can guarantee that your color is going to look just fine. If you need to stretch it a little bit longer than 4 weeks, you can do that. But I would probably recommend that you do the calibration, in those intervals, and you're going to see that your display does slightly change over time, but not so much. And one thing that I didn't mention in this video yet is that whether you have a brand new display or a display that is a little bit older, a few years older, even older than that, if you're going to run a calibration on it, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to turn the display on, leave it so that it's showing a color, or have a website with things moving around for at least 15 to 20 minutes, if not 30 minutes before you start the calibration, because this is going to give the backlight, even the LED ones, the backlight for the opportunity for it to warm up properly and show the most even color possible. So those would be the things to remember before you start any display calibration process. And on that note, I am going to leave this here and answer some of the questions you may have. youtube.com/artistwrite is the best sources to find any answers to a lot of questions you may have about color management. But if you have any more questions, you can always comment on the video. I reply to every single one of them, or you can also email me at hello@artistwrite.com. And I think there's one question right now. We have a question that was being posted. I have a Spider 4 by Data Color. Will this work with BenQ products, specifically SW271? The short answer to that is yes, it will work just fine. My longer answer to that is that Spider 4 was released in somewhere around circa 2010 and before. The sensor inside that device is getting old, depending on when you purchase the device, but the sensor is getting old, and it is also an older type sensor that they put in those devices as well. And from experience calibrating using both brand of the devices, and I run multiple independent tests, I can tell you right now that if you have an older Spider 4 or 5, it's probably time for you to upgrade to a newer device. Now, you can choose certainly to upgrade to Spider X, but my recommendation would still be Calibrate, Color Checker Display Pro, or Display Plus, for all the reasons that I have explained earlier in this video, or in this recording or presentation.
They all work. They all work. Art, thank you so much, man. Now, I want to ask in regards to monitors themselves, how often do you recommend people, or how often should people think about replacing their monitors?
That's a really great question. So for that, I would say you can definitely use your display until it starts to do a couple of things. If a display is starting to fail, it may flicker, there may be lines on the panel or something like that. That will probably be a good time to replace the display. There's another thing that if you have an older display panel in your studio, you may notice is what I call LCD bleeding, is that you see like some dark spot on LCD, especially when it's cold. Sometime when it warms up, those would go away. But as if you start to see your LCD, showing an even color, whatever that may be, I would probably say it's a good time to replace your display at that point. But in general, I would say that if you use your display, 3 to 5 years, it's not an unreasonable number to ask. I mean, BenQ display guarantee, or BenQ guarantees their display for 3 years. And I have, for example, one of the first SW2700 PT that was released in 2015 that still runs just fine today too. So, it's not that every single panel from that line will have some issues or develop issues. It just depends. Sometimes you just draw the lucky number and your panel goes a little bit earlier. Sometimes they last longer, but I would just evaluate it based on that. Now, one more thing I want to add as well is that most of the displays you get today are using IPS, they're LED backlight. They're much more stable than what we have had before, technology wise for backlight. Before then, like about a decade ago, we have like CCFL, which is those fluorescence tube that were lighting up the thing. Those have a tendency to show a lot of color shift. LED, much less so.
Okay. And it looks like we have some more questions pouring in for you here. Judy Cooper asking, is calibrating the laptop different from a desktop? How would you calibrate the MacBook Pro 16? Is that on your YouTube channel?
So I think the MacBook Pro 16, if you have the new one with the M1 chip, that would also include the 14-inch as well. I do have a guide on how to calibrate that, but I said it also in my video on my channel that I don't recommend that. The best thing that you can do as a pro, if you have those laptops, is use the reference mode or preset that are built into those display. And I have a full guide walking anyone who wants to learn how to do that through how to do it, including a separate video explaining what the reference mode is, how to use them, how to interface with them as well. And also the thing that I talk about doing the white point fine tune, or rather fine tune calibration. I have a guide on how to do that on my channel as well. It's a fairly lengthy process, but that video outlines everything and is really too much to really be doing that demo in this, shorter presentation time.
Definitely. And Judy had a follow-up there. Do you recommend calibrating for HDR photos?
So the HDR photo is a very interesting question. Now, I have another video on my website because Adobe just recently announced Camera Raw 15, and they have a technology preview for HDR output. So certain displays out there right now can output HDR. For example, the 14 and 16-inch XDR display inside their MacBook Pro, and also the Pro Display XDR can do high definition output. And the colors, I mean, once you see that, it's really hard to go back to just edit your picture normally because everything just popped. Now, in regards to calibrating HDR photo, I don't think that is what you're referring to. I think you're just referring to shooting HDR photo. And regardless of if you shoot normal or HDR, if you're working with pictures and you're critical about color and you care about the way how your color is going to look, I highly recommend calibrating your display, because that's going to be the first thing. Because if you really think about it, your display is the portal to pretty much every single other thing that happens after capture. You edit on your display, you make sure that it looks the way how you want it, then you send it out to the world, right? But everything is done on the display. So you want to have that singular point not be the point of failure, but the point of success for you. And that's why I recommend calibrating the display, especially if you are a pro.
Okay. We had a question from Paul joining us. Which colorimeter and software should I use for a BenQ SW321C?
So I recommend, like I said before, Color Checker Display Pro, Color Checker Display Plus, or any of the variant of that device from x-rite that I've shared earlier in this presentation. If you have those, it will work as well. Now, let me also say this, that if you have a Spider X, you don't need to go out and buy a new calibrator. They are compatible with it. They will work with it. So even though it may not be the device that I recommend, for example, I don't even recommend the Color Checker Studio, the color spectrophotometer for BenQ display calibration. But if you have those, they are compatible and they will work. Now, on the same token, if you have an older device, for example, like we had talked about earlier, Spider 4, Spider 5, those sensors are already aging, and that will be the reason why you may want to consider upgrading, but they are compatible. There are certain caveats to those. So I would watch one of those update bulletin videos on my website on what best setting to use for those devices because they are slightly different. And the software that you would use would be Palette Master Element from BenQ to calibrate the SW display. This way, you have a true hardware calibration. Because my best analogy is this: if you have a hardware calibrated display and you're just really doing a software calibration on it, it's like having a Ferrari that you're really just driving at 10 miles per hour in first gear for its entire life. And that's not a fun car to drive. You want to get the best possible. So if you have a hardware calibrated display, go through the hardware calibration method. And I have a walkthrough guide and everything on how to do that as well.
Okay. Now, for your regular photographers, filmmakers, somebody who's just, I need a new display. They don't really know where to go. They do photo video stuff. What are the features that, I mean, there's so many specs and features out there. What should we really be paying attention to in a monitor?
So if you, so I would say, I'm going to, good question. Let's start with that. So lots of ways to answer that question. If you're doing video, I would say, depending on how critical your color grading work is, BenQ PD line display will work just fine. They're really well calibrated from the factory. They'll cover the color gamut for video in both P3 and Rec 709 just fine without any problems. If you do dapple and photo, those will work as well. Now, if you are a photographer and you print, this is where the distinction comes in. If you're a photographer and you print, or even if you don't print, considering BenQ SW line is not a bad idea, because the one differentiation between the SW line, other than the hardware calibration, is the fact that every single model has 99% Adobe RGB capability. And if you print, majority of the printers right now, especially inkjet printers that you may have in your studio, are still printing based on Adobe RGB color gamut. We have not made the change in the industry to shift to P3 or Pro Photo or anything else just yet. So at this point in time, if especially if that is your workflow, I recommend getting the SW. Now, I also know photographers who don't print, but they want to get the best color possible unequivocally, and BenQ SW displays are really great for that.
Okay. And along that same vein there, when it comes to the size of the monitor, is there kind of a sweet spot for most people? I understand this is going to depend on situational and obviously, what kind of space you have. But is there such thing as a monitor that's just too big for what somebody needs? Or is there a time when you should look for, you don't really need to go for a monitor that's takes up the entire room?
Yeah, I think if your monitor is like 103 inch, like fills the whole wall, probably a little too much.
That's
You're not gonna
overkill.
get a good play of it. A little overkill there. Now, I would say this: SW line displays ends at around 32 inch. There are certain bigger ones displays out there at 34. I think depending on the aspect ratio, there are some 34-inch widescreen that I think are good. 38-inch, I think it's starting to get a little too big. There are some 42s out there that are just like, yep, that's just way too much for photo, and your eyes is going to strain before anything else. I would say 32 is a nice upper limit for photography. I would venture that 27-inch is going to be the optimal format for most photographers, space-wise, and also the comfortability of using a display. And that's also going to be really key as well. For example, if you're not used to for example, if you're not used to working with large displays, or you haven't worked with a display other than like the one built into your laptop, the moment you take that 27-inch display out and put it in your office at home, it's going to be huge. And if you take, for example, like a 32-inch display, it's going to pretty much take up a good chunk of your office, depending on how big your office is, of course. My classic analogy is this: if you see a 32-inch display at a convention center, don't let that fool you. It's actually much bigger than it is. Same thing with BH. If you see it at 32, the SW321C at BH, it looks small in BH because they have a lot of displays there, big space, right? The moment you take that, you pop in a room, it's just like the monitor expands and it fills up your space. So don't let that fool you. I mean, I would start to measure the size out a little bit because those are huge panels. But let me simply put it this way: working on those 32-inch like 4K is the current one that I have right now, I would not trade that for anything else. Like it's an absolute joy. And SW321C has been my daily driver display since it has launched. So I'll put it that much. I have been using dual 32-inch 4K displays from BenQ, and especially with that one, it's since launch. And the one great thing about the SW321C2 is that if you haven't seen it in person, you have to, because what is showing on that display, it's like a matted print. They have refined a special type of coating on that display that, I kid you not, it looks like a matted print. In fact, in my review, what I have done is actually show that picture, or actually put a print on there, and I pulled the print out and it looks exactly the same when I was doing the display review. It's that matte. I kid you not.
Wow. Well, Art, I want to thank you, man. This was, you've probably forgotten more than I'll ever know in 3 lifetimes. So this was great. That was a ton of information. This makes a wonderful piece of content for people to come back to and refer to time and time again, because color really is so important, whether you're just posting pictures on Instagram, or especially if you're printing and doing anything more. So Art, I want to say a huge thank you to you. Obviously, a huge thank you to BenQ for hosting today's event, and to all of our viewers out there for getting engaged, getting your questions in, and always sticking with us. The #1 place for free education when it comes to audio, photo, video, all that stuff. But Art, huge thank you again, and to the team at BenQ. But that is all we have for tonight. This evening is a wrap with the B&H virtual event space. We'll catch y'all next time.
Thanks, everyone.